people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
In the summer of 1787, 55 men would gather in Philadelphia. They were tasked with fixing the government of the United States of America. Over the course of 4 months, they would debate, argue, refine and prepare the first document of its kind in the history of mankind, an attempt to prove that men can rule themselves by law. Over the next 3 years, the 13 United States would debate the ratification. This is the story of those men and of those times. It is a look at the ideas, the concepts, the debates, and the history of the Constitution of the United States. This is Constitution Thursday.
The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures. When vacancies happen in the representation of any state in the Senate, the executive authority of such state shall issue writs of election to fill such vacancies, provided that the legislature of any state may empower the executive thereof to make temporary appointments until the people fill the vacancies by election as the legislature may direct. This amendment shall not be so construed as to affect the election or term of any senator chosen before it becomes valid as part of the Constitution. 17th Amendment of the United States of America passed 1913, ratified in 1913. Today we look at how the muckraking press played a role in the 17th Amendment in Federalist 62. It's Constitution Thursday, right here on Plausibly Live, the Dave Bowman Show podcast. You have to go back a long way in history to get to that term muckraking. Now, it can be pronounced a couple of ways. I've heard it muck raking, muck racking. My preference is muckraking, but that's just because I'm pedantic and stubborn in my ways. Muck raking is probably far more correct because, of course, the term derives from the process of raking muck. And that's where you have it. If you look it up in the dictionary today, of course, it applies almost exclusively to media types who are perceived as being anti-government or hostile to government, if not anti-government. If you follow what I'm saying? The modern usage actually comes from Theodore Roosevelt in the 1900s when he began to bust up businesses and trust busting and the likes of that. And William Randolph Hearst really began the birth of what we know today as investigative journalism, where journalists weren't necessarily printing exactly what they were given by the government. They were digging and they were mucking up the raking up the muck, as it were, and kind of throwing it out into the street for everybody to see. And of course, the president, Roosevelt, as he was then, referred to them as that. And there was this adversarial relationship that Roosevelt really built on. But even he was a populist, and so the papers tended to support his ideas of opposing big business and moving the country into a progressive era. But there was a problem that they had, and that problem was the United States Senate, which is what we're going to get to here in just a minute. But the term goes back, muckraking goes back way further. It goes back into the pre-industrial age of world history. You got to go back to a time when people lived in crappy houses. I mean, it was the article I was reading the other day about the way life was lived in the pre-industrial age is horrifying. I mean, I certainly have my own habits today. You know, I don't want to be anywhere that's more than an hour away from a shower. We've talked before about, you know, some of the things that I'll go home to use the bathroom before I'll use the bathroom at work, that sort of things. But in those days, you know, they didn't have bathrooms. They didn't have running water. They didn't have the amenities that we take for granted today. They lived in generally one-room houses. 90% of them, in fact, 90% of all human beings that have ever lived throughout history lived on farms or in farming type communities. The house was usually dirt floored, and initially dirt floored. But because they didn't have bathrooms, they didn't have latrines, they didn't have tables, they didn't have beds per se, things tended to pile up on the floor. And then they would cover it with straw, and then things would pile up, and they'd cover it with straw, and then they'd pile up, and then they'd cover with straw. And eventually, basically, what you had was this deep mess of muck that stank. I mean, it smelled horribly. It would, depending on the weather, if it was really hot, it could be, you know, just horrible. If it was wet, it could be mucky and muddy and make you just kind of gag thinking about it. And eventually, you would have someone who would come along with a rake, and their job was to rake out the muck into the street where it could be washed down into the local water supply, which was usually the local river or creek or whatever. And so they were called the Muck Rakers. And it's a term that developed in that pre-industrial age. It was actually used in 1680 something by the guy that wrote Pilgrim's Progress, the great Christian Tolmec, and it goes back to that point. It really does. And so you have this vision of this person whose job it is to rake out all the filth and basically expose it for everybody to see. I mean, that's what they did. And so in the early 1900s, in the first decade of the 1900s, the 20th century, these investigative journalists, as promoted by William Randolph Hearst, in essence were doing that. They were digging up the dirt on people and exposing it for everybody to see. And President Roosevelt, the first one, Teddy, referred to them as muck rakers because they were exposing the government in ways that they didn't necessarily want it exposed. They didn't want things out there quite like that. And yet here they were doing it. And it became, like I said, very adversarial. In some ways, however, beneficial. The president certainly used it to his benefit, even though he constantly criticized them for making up what he called false news stories and publishing them. Gosh, that sounds really familiar, doesn't it? Doesn't it? A president saying the press is lying and calling them out. Man, just seems like I've heard that somewhere before. And yet here it was, 1906, particularly when Theodore Roosevelt really went on the rampage against all of that. It becomes intriguing because there's a movement in the country at this point, and there's something going on, and it's the realization that the government has become not what we want it to be. It's become somewhat, if not intensely corrupt. It certainly has elements in it that are protecting things that the president, Roosevelt, is trying to get rid of. The Congress, and particularly the United States Senate, by the early 1900s, is seen as a millionaire's club. It's seen as people whose entire job is to protect the interests of big business and not the people of the United States. It's seen in ways that are corrupt. It's seen as almost evil. And these muckraking journalists, as they are called, are really going after senators left and right, but particularly one has he's got a big target on him for them. He doesn't care. but he has a big target on him. Keep in mind that at this point in history, in accordance with what the framers had wanted and what Madison really addresses, but not as intensely as you would like to, in Federalist 62, which was released this week in 1788, he outlines the reasons why the Senate is this way. And of course, it's seen as an improvement on the House of Lords in London, because it's not hereditary. It's intentionally not this way. This compromise, this Connecticut compromise that has been hammered out, is what really allows the federalism aspect of the Constitution to work. You've got big states with lots of representatives in the House, and you've got small states with little representation in the House, but you've got this Senate that has equal representation across the board. And if you'll go back to when we talked about the convention, this was really the biggest sticking point. I mean, it really was. There's a lot of other things that really, caused debates. Slavery was one, but this really was the point where, if the small states did not get equal representation in the Senate, this was not going to work. They were going to walk. Delaware at one point, if you recall, threatening to ask for foreign intervention, the story of Abraham Baldwin and his vote change, and Daniel St. Thomas of Jennifer, who mysteriously just didn't show up to vote against the plan that day. How odd that would happen. At any rate, they got this compromise through, and now Madison is trying to explain it to the people of New York that this is actually advantageous. New York, of course, a large state. They have large representation, and there's a lot of concern that the South might be overrepresented because of the 3/5 compromise, but it's this Senate, this House of Lords type thing, this improvement on that really kind of balances that out. The fact that they have to be older is important because it means that they're wiser. The citizenship requirement that's put on the Senate is extended much longer than it is for the House. Why, you might say? I mean, why did they do that? Because the Senate, as Madison explains, deals with foreign affairs. They have to approve treaties. And it's felt that the longer citizenship requirement will cause loyalties to former countries. Remember, a lot of people in that era were still from another place. It was felt that would kind of diminish those. Kind of wash them down a little bit, and maybe they won't be quite so loyal to their previous country, and they'll think of America first rather than the other country first, even in the Senate. So all of this is going on as he explains this. And of course, the Constitution is ratified. And for the first, 120 years or so, we have states appointing and or electing their senators by their state legislature. But this is seen as the progressive era really begins in the 1880s. This is seen as anti-democratic. Now again, we weren't there. It's hard for me to sit here today and judge the wisdom of that, because I can't sit down with somebody from the 1880s, 1890s and say, okay, why do you feel this way? What is it that bothers you about not publicly electing, the public not electing senators, that's really sticking in your craw? Because living when I do, having experienced it, these are the things that it's going to cause if you do this. But a person of that era might have explained to me the problems that they faced, which were important problems, but this is where that muckraking press comes in. They were problems, but they weren't problems without a solution. But if you never talk about the solution, you only talk about the problem. This is endemic of progressivism, folks, and we've talked about this on numerous occasions. The definition of progressivism is to take a perceived social problem and use a government solution to solve perceived social problem. And it was perceived that election of the senators by the state legislatures was not democratic. And this was a problem. So there began a movement several times in the House of Representatives. The amendment that would eventually become the 17th Amendment was introduced at least 3 times. and passing the House each time, but defeated by the Senate, obviously, because the Senate was like, no, why would we agree to this? This is insane. No, we don't want this. The states don't want this. The states themselves, the state governments themselves, were wise enough to see that this could be devastating to the states' power in the Congress of the United States. And it would become 100% the people, which, again, you could argue is okay. James Wilson at the convention certainly argued that. He wanted the Senate elected popularly all along. He was defeated in that idea because, again, you had this concept of state sovereignty and states' rights and that sort of things that, particularly slavery, that the states wanted to protect. And they wanted to protect that balance between the two. And so the wisdom of the way the Senate was set up for its era was brilliant. Come along, slavery is now a moot point. States are, in the post-Civil War era, the antebellum era, antebellum, that's wrong, postbellum era would be, we're starting to enact laws that required the 14th Amendment to correct them. They were abusing the rights of their citizens. And you had this movement towards more pure democracy, certainly in the Senate. Now, again, we didn't live in that era. It's hard for me to sit here now and say they were wrong. They were wrong, but maybe for the right reasons. There were certainly problems with the Senate. It was perceived as having become a millionaires' club. And why did it get that way? Because the state legislatures elected the senators. What would end up happening is each of the parties, of course, would, whichever party controlled the state legislature, would approve its candidate. The party would say, okay, this is the guy we want in the Senate. And usually that was done, much like it's done today, I'm sorry to say, which was money and favors. Whoever had the most money could influence the party to support them to be the senator, and consequently then they would become the senator nominee in the legislature. If it was bulky, uncooperative, would be influenced, air quote, bought, and you would have people go into the Senate who were essentially buying their way into it, regardless of experience, and certainly without regard to what their personal policy preferences were. And ultimately, you ended up with people in the Senate who were more beholden to their parties than they were to their states even, let alone the people of their states. And this was seen as bad. The second problem you had was you would have deadlocks in state legislatures. What if they were, split and, you had a Republican House and a Democrat Senate or vice versa, and they couldn't agree. And the executive didn't have any power to do that. Now, 3 states saw this as stupid. And in the 1880s and 1890s, 3 states actually started popular election of their senates. The Constitution is clear that people can decide, that states can decide that. And so they did. This seemed to work for those 3 states. Utah had a problem in that it got gridlocked with the split house. And you would have times where you would have states that didn't send senators to Washington, D.C. for years. Delaware went like 3-4 years without having a senator in the Senate of the United States. And of course, you can see where that's going to create some problems. Number one, the state doesn't have any representation, or doesn't have its complete representation. But number two, you have issues with quorums, which gives you issues with treaties, which gives you issues with confirmation hearings, so forth and so on. Utah gridlocked, but managed to solve its problem. And it held up its solution, which I'm not going to describe to you. I mean, it's the point is they solved it. They held it up as an example, but the Muck Rakers weren't really interested in the solution to the problem, because if they solve the problem that way, then they don't get what they want, which is the popular election of senators. That's what they're really pushing for. And they hit on one particular guy, a senator from Rhode Island by the name of Nelson Aldrich. Now, maybe you've heard of him, maybe you haven't. Nelson Aldrich is the poster child for everything that was wrong with the Senate in the progressive era, from the 1890s to the 1910s. He was powerful. He was owned by the business interests. I mean, he would stop. Imagine today, if you're a conservative, how much you detest Harry Reid. And if you're a progressive or liberal or moderate, imagine how much you hate Mitch McConnell. If you took the hatred that those two groups have today for those two people, combined them together, it wouldn't be half of what the entire country hated Nelson Aldrich, who was from Rhode Island and had essentially bought his seat. He was a very powerful, very rich man who had bought the seat and controlled everything. And there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, even if the state wanted to get rid of him, Rhode Island, which of course, it's Rhode Island, so of course they don't. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't get rid of him. And so he became the focal point for the Muck Rakers as they began to really criticize and complain about all of these things that had happened. All of these things that had really turned the nation into this corrupt, business-friendly, big business-friendly, anti-populist, anti-people, not working for the benefit of the people body in the Senate that had just become uncontrollable. And so, of course, the papers would print this, and William Randolph Hearst was instrumental in this, and the papers printing articles just digging up the dirt on people like Aldrich and others as well, talking about how they were, essentially just bought and sold. They bought their way into the Senate. They don't really care about you, me, anybody else. They don't care about the United States. They care about enriching themselves. And of course, Aldrich, who made some business decisions, he had a lot of interest in railroads and the like, sold all that after some bills passed the Senate that benefited that. And so he made millions more. And of course, this didn't sit well with people. And the whole thing really began to percolate amongst the people, and the solutions, like Utah had found, were not as intriguing to people as, what, we'll fix your wagon. We'll start voting for the senators ourselves. And eventually, you had a movement to have what we would call today an Article 5 convention, which is a convention of the states, was threatened to change the election of senators from the state legislature to the people, since the Senate kept killing that amendment. Eventually, in 1912, that amendment passed the House and the Senate and was quickly ratified by the states. And since 1913, we've had the popular election of the senators of the United States of America. Now, we consider today, and if you're a 10th Amendmenter, if you're a Tea Party type person, you're probably going to complain about that, and you think we need to repeal that and go back to the state's appointment. Clearly, there are some issues with it. The senators no longer represent necessarily the interests of a sovereign state. This is how we end up with a national debt the way it is. It's how we end up with populist programs that distribute money rather than for the benefit of the nation, but for the benefit of a district and a population back home. There's very little focus on the best interest of the nation. We end up with confirmation hearings for anything that are more partisan than they are senatorial. These are all problems that came about that. But we got to keep something in mind here, which is that the previous system wasn't necessarily working either. The Muck Rakers weren't totally wrong about how some of these very powerful men were ending up in the United States Senate and thus controlling everything in the country. And men like Aldrich were great examples of this. And he wasn't the only one, by the way. There was a senator from, I can't remember his name now, Storr, I think, I don't remember where he's from, who was just corrupt, but he had money, and so he could buy his way into things. It wasn't incorrect. There were other solutions. But the lesson here is how powerful the press can be when it comes to exposing that corruption, and then, as I've said before, getting the reader to come to the correct conclusion, which wasn't, in their view, was not, hey, the states need to work harder on this, the states need to work out their own solutions on this, but instead change it to a progressive, more democratic philosophy, less Republican and more democratic, little r, little d, not public parties, and simply change the system over to that. Now, again, there were framers who supported this idea from the beginning, and there were framers who supported the idea that state sovereignty needed to be done away with anyway. There just needed to be a national government. So the idea had been around for as long as the Constitution had been around. The compromise, as done in 1787, was more about protecting, let's be honest, it was more about protecting slavery than it was about necessarily state sovereignty in the sense of, the broader aspects of the country. But at the same time, it worked. It maintained a certain level of financial wisdom that seemed to be lost when it became, for better or worse, the progressive era. And those are things we've got to consider when we think about whether or not we're going to go back and repeal this or not. I think that the truth of the matter is that there are advantages and disadvantages to both systems. However, in the broader aspect, I think the framers got it right the first time. The question is, now that we have the new system, I can't even imagine 35 states ratifying, 36 states ratifying to go back to the original system. I can't even in my brain picture that would ever happen. But stranger things have happened, I guess, in the big, wide, wonderful world. And the end of the day, is the lesson here that, the democratic election of senators, the direct election of senators is a good thing or bad thing? Or is the lesson here that the country was essentially moved by a populist movement of muck rakers into accepting a solution that had not really been considered with any alternatives to that? And I think that's the most important lesson of the Muck Rakers and the 17th Amendment. I think it's worth our time to step back and consider for just a moment or two whether or not we allow the press to manipulate us. Even though the stories might be true, that's fine. But are the solutions that they're pushing necessarily the right solutions or not? And even to the degree of today's fake news, we argue about fake news all the time. Well, but ultimately, fake news is in the eye of the beholder. It's only fake if you allow yourself to be influenced by it or make your decisions based on it, rather than using the logic that could have and should have been used back in, say, 1906, 1907, and certainly in 1912 and 1913. There were other solutions available. And you have to wonder today, if they had taken those solutions, would it be different? And what would the media be doing today? What kind of muck raking would they be doing today? And would the president support it or not? Those are questions that they're kind of in Schrodinger's box right now, but they're interesting to ask and follow along with. So that's how we got the 17th Amendment and how the press played a huge role in that.
The great fundamental issue now before our people can be stated briefly. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not. I believe in the right of the people to rule. I believe that the majority of the plain people of the United States will, day in and day out, make fewer mistakes in governing themselves than any smaller class or body of men, no matter what their training, will make in trying to govern them. I believe again that the American people are as a whole capable of self-control and of learning by their mistakes. Our opponents pay lip loyalty to this doctrine, but they show their real beliefs by the way in which they champion every device to make the nominal rule of the people a sham. I am not leading this fight as a matter of aesthetic pleasure. I am leading because somebody must lead, or else the fight would not be made at all. I prefer to work with moderate, with rational conservatives, provided only that they do in good faith strive forward towards the light. But when they halt and turn their backs to the light, sit with the scorners on the seats of reaction, then I must part company with them.
Constitution Thursday is a feature segment on Plausibly Live, the official podcast of The Dave Bowman Show, a Slippery Fish Entertainment production for the Podcast 99 Network. Copyright MMXV. All rights reserved. For more information, log on to constitutionthursday.com.